When we look at the royal family of the Pride Lands, one visual contrast stands out immediately. The striking difference between Mufasa's magnificent golden mane and Scar's sleek black one. Most viewers assume this was simply a design choice to distinguish the heroic brother from the villainous one. But what if this distinction goes far deeper than mere aesthetics? What if Scar's dark mane isn't just a visual shorthand for his villainy, but actually represents a complex genetic code that runs through the entire royal lineage of the Pride Lands? A code that might explain far more than just appearance, but personality, leadership qualities, and in real lion populations, mane color is determined by genetics and environmental factors, including testosterone levels. Darker manes in nature are often associated with higher testosterone, aggression, and dominance traits that align perfectly with Scar's character. Scientists studying lions in the Serengeti have found that lions with darker manes often have higher levels of testosterone, are more likely to recover from injury, and typically have longer But Disney's animators took this natural phenomenon and embedded it into a sophisticated genetic narrative that few have fully decoded until now. When we examine the Pride Lands lineage carefully, we notice a pattern. The golden mane trait appears to be dominant in the royal family, expressed clearly in Mohatu, Ahadi, Mufasa, and Simba. Yet the dark mane gene persists as a recessive trait, emerging in Scar and later seemingly echoed in Kovu's appearance. Even though we know canonically that Kovu is not Scar's biological son, he develops strikingly similar physical traits, the most notable being his dark mane. This presents us with an intriguing genetic mystery. How could these similar traits appear in unrelated lions? And what does this tell us about the genetic heritage of the Pride Lands? To answer this, we need to understand how genetics works in lion populations. In real lions, mane development is influenced by multiple genes, not just a single one. The same would logically apply to the lions of the Pride Lands. What we're witnessing with Scar isn't just a random mutation, but potentially a recessive genetic package that was already present in the royal bloodline, waiting for the right circumstance. Let's look at the visual evidence. When we examine Ahadi, Mufasa and Scar's father, in the expanded universe materials, we see a lion with a predominantly golden mane but with darker tips, suggesting he could be a carrier for the dark mane gene without fully expressing it. This would explain how both Mufasa and Scar could come from the same parents yet have such different phenotype. The truly fascinating aspect emerges when we look at Kovu. Despite not being Scar's biological offspring, Kovu develops a dark mane, green eyes, and even receives a facial scar in almost the exact location as his supposed mentor. This cannot be mere coincidence. It suggests something profound about genetics in the Pride Lands, that certain traits are somehow selected for or activated by specific environmental or psych. Could there be a genetic destiny at work? A predetermined code that manifests not just in appearance but in psychological predispositions? The evidence suggests that the dark mane in the Pride Lands royal family isn't just a physical trait, but a marker of a specific genetic package that includes physical, mental, and behavioral predispositions. And here's where our first major revelation comes in. What if the dark mane gene isn't randomly distributed but specifically activated in lions who experience certain psychological triggers? Lions who feel overlooked, secondary, or denied their perceived rightful place. Both Scar and Kovu share this experience. Scar lived in Mufasa's shadow, while Kovu was raised to believe he deserved a throne that wasn't his by birth. This would explain how two genetically unrelated lions could end up expressing such similar physical traits. It's not just about DNA, but about how specific circumstances activate dormant genetic potentials. This theory opens up an entirely new way of understanding the complex family dynamics of the Pride Lands. It suggests that the dark mane gene might not be a random mutation, but a built-in genetic failsafe, a biological response to specific social and psychological circumstances that has persisted throughout generations of pride. But if this is true, what does it tell us about Kovu's true parentage? And what might it mean for future generations of Pride Lands rulers? The genetic code hidden in that distinctive dark mane may hold far more secrets than we ever imagined. To truly understand the genetic puzzle of the Pride Lands royal family, we need to trace the lineage back further than just Mufasa and Scar. The extended universe materials, while not always considered strictly canonical, provide us with valuable insights into earlier generations that help complete. Let's begin with Mohatu, Mufasa, and Scar's grandfather. The visual depictions of Mohatu show him with a rich golden-red mane, robust build, and warm amber eyes, traits that would later be prominently displayed in Mufasa and Simba. This suggests that the golden mane phenotype was strongly established in the direct. Then there's Ahadi, father to Mufasa and Scar. Ahadi's appearance is particularly revealing from a genetic perspective. Most renditions show him with a predominantly golden mane, but with subtle darker tips or streaks, a visual hint that he carried the recessive dark mane gene without fully expressing it. This makes perfect genetic sense. As a carrier, he could pass this trait to his offspring, explaining how Scar could inherit and express the full dark mane phenotype. But the maternal line is equally important. Uru, mother to both Mufasa and Scar, is typically depicted with a darker coat than most Pridelands lionesses. Her eyes in most interpretations have a greenish tint, strikingly similar to Scar's distinctive green eyes. This suggests that Uru contributed significant genetic material to Scar's distinctive appearance. When we map out these genetic markers visually, an intriguing pattern emerges. Mane color ranges from golden, dominant, to black, recessive. Eye color, amber red, dominant to green, recessive. Body structure, robust and muscular, dominant, to lean and angular, recessive. Facial structure, rounded features, dominant to sharp, angular features, recessive. What's remarkable is how these traits cluster together rather than being randomly distributed. Lions who express one recessive trait tend to express others as well, suggesting what geneticists call linkage, where certain genes are inherited together because they're located close to each other. This brings us to an important genetic concept: phenotypic expression. A phenotype is the physical manifestation of genes, influenced not just by the genes themselves, but by environmental factors. In lions, we know that nutrition, hormones, and even climate can affect mane development. In the Pridelands context, this suggests that while Scar may have inherited the genetic potential for a dark mane from his parents, other factors may have. What environmental factors might trigger the expression of these recessive traits? When we analyze the circumstances of Scar's development, we notice he was the second-born, living in the shadow of his brother who was destined to be king. This position of perceived disadvantage, the psychological stress of being secondary, could potentially trigger epigenetic changes, modifications that affect how genes express themselves without changing the underlying DNA sequence. This theory gains strength when we look at seemingly unrelated characters who share physical similarities. Take another look at Nuka from The Lion King 2. Despite being allegedly Scar's biological son, though this is never explicitly confirmed, he doesn't fully express the dark mane phenotype. Instead, he has a scruffy, partially developed dark mane. If these traits were purely genetic, Nuka should fully express them if he inherited them from Scar. The incomplete expression suggests that environmental factors, perhaps his malnourishment in the Outlands or his psychological insecurity, prevented the full. Then there's Kovu, who begins with no visible connection to the dark mane lineage, but gradually develops these traits as he's groomed to be Scar's heir. His development of a dark mane happens alongside his psychological development, suggesting again that genetic expression is tied to experience and environment. But here's where our investigation takes a fascinating turn. When we look at ancient cave paintings briefly glimpsed in the Lion King universe, we see hints of much earlier Pridelands rulers. In these fleeting images, there appears to be at least one ancient king with a distinctly darker mane. This visual evidence suggests something profound. The dark mane gene isn't new to the royal lineage. It's been there all along, occasionally expressing itself throughout generations. This reveals a startling possibility. What if Scar's appearance isn't a new mutation, but a genetic throwback to an ancient ruler? What if this recessive genetic package has always existed in the royal bloodline, emerging periodically when specific conditions are met? If this is true, then the dark mane isn't just a random trait. It's an ancient genetic alternative that has been preserved in the royal lineage for generations. Its persistence suggests it might serve some evolutionary purpose within the complex social structure. But what purpose could this serve? Why would a pride maintain two distinct genetic pathways for its rulers? And what triggers determine which pathway is expressed? The answers may lie in understanding the science behind the dark mane trait itself. To fully comprehend the dark mane phenomenon in the Pridelands, we need to delve deeper into the science of lion genetics and how these principles manifest in the royal lineage. In real lions, mane color is a polygenic trait, meaning it's influenced by multiple genes rather than a single one. This complexity allows for wide variation in mane colors, from light blonde. In genetic terms, we can analyze the primary features of what we'll call the dark mane phenotype exhibited by Scar and later by Kovu. Dark mane. In real lions, darker manes correlate with higher testosterone levels and are often indicators of genetic fitness despite their less frequent occurrence. Lean build, a more slender body type compared to the robust structure of Mufasa's lineage. Green eyes, a rare recessive trait in lions whose eyes are typically amber or yellow. Angular features, sharper, more defined facial structure compared to the rounded features of the dominant lineage. In genetic inheritance, traits are passed through dominant and recessive alleles. Dominant traits need only one copy of the gene to be expressed, while recessive traits require two copies, one from each parent. This explains why the golden mane appears more frequently in the Pridelands lineage. It's likely the dominant trait that masks the recessive dark mane gene when both. For Scar to express all these recessive traits, he would need to inherit recessive alleles from both parents. This is entirely possible given what we know about Ahadi and Uru's appearance, suggesting they were both carriers of these recessive traits without fully expressing them. But here's where the genetic mystery deepens. How could Kovu, who is canonically not Scar's biological offspring, develop such strikingly similar traits? To answer this, we need to explore more complex genetic concepts. First is the phenomenon of genetic convergence, where similar traits evolve independently due to similar environmental pressures. In small, isolated populations like the Pridelands pride, certain genetic combinations may recur not because of direct inheritance, but because the limited gene pool increases the chance of similar combinations appearing. The Outlands pride, where Kovu was born, likely shares some distant ancestry with the Pridelands lions. After all, Zira and her followers were originally from the Pridelands before their exile. This means the recessive dark mane genes could exist in their population. What's particularly fascinating is the concept of genetic pressure in isolated populations. When a pride has limited genetic diversity due to geographical isolation, like the Pridelands being surrounded by desert, certain genetic traits may become more concentrated. This explains why traits like the dark mane might persist despite being recessive. The limited gene pool means these genes keep recirculating within the population. Even more compelling is the scientific concept of environmental gene activation. In modern genetics, we know that genes can be switched on or off by environmental factors through a process called epigenetics. These changes don't alter the DNA sequence itself but affect how genes express themselves. When we analyze Kovu's development, we see this principle in action. He begins with no visible similarity to Scar, but as he's raised in an environment designed to mold him into Scar's heir, subjected to similar psychological stressors and socialization, his physical appearance begins to change accordingly. His mane darkens, his build remains lean despite adequate nutrition, and his overall appearance begins. This suggests something revolutionary about the Pridelands genetics. Certain traits may be activated by specific psychological or environmental triggers, rather than being purely determined at birth. The correlation between genetic traits and behavioral tendencies becomes even more apparent when we observe personality patterns. Both Scar and Kovu, in his early development, exhibit similar behavioral traits: intelligence, strategic thinking, a tendency toward introspection, and initial difficulty integrating with the pride's social structure. These aren't merely learned behaviors, they appear to be part of the genetic package associated with the dark mane. In real lions, we know that certain behaviors have genetic components. Aggression levels, territorial instincts, and even social bonding behaviors have heritable elements. The Pridelands lions seem to display an exaggerated version of this phenomenon, where physical traits and behavioral predispositions are tightly. This brings us to our most shocking revelation. The dark mane gene appears to be activated by specific psychological conditions related to perceived injustice or exclusion from power. Both Scar and Kovu experienced similar psychological circumstances during their development. Both were secondary males not initially in line for leadership. Both experienced some form of exclusion from the pride's power structure. Both were subjected to expectations that conflicted with their natural inclinations. These shared experiences suggest that the dark mane trait isn't randomly distributed, but specifically activated in lions who experience certain psychological triggers. The gene exists as a recessive trait throughout the population, but only expresses itself fully when these specific environmental conditions are met. This theory explains the seemingly impossible genetic similarity between unrelated lions like Scar and Kovu. It's not that Kovu inherited Scar's genes directly. It's that he inherited the same recessive genetic package that exists throughout the Pridelands population, and similar environmental triggers cause those genes to express themselves in similar ways. But if this is true, it raises a profound question. What is the relationship between Scar and Kovu that goes beyond their superficial resemblance? And what might this reveal about Kovu's true parentage and genetic heritage? One of the most intriguing aspects of The Lion King 2 is the relationship between Scar and Kovu. The film explicitly states that Kovu is not Scar's biological son, yet their physical resemblance is undeniable. This apparent contradiction creates the perfect genetic mystery for us to unravel. Let's first establish what we know canonically. Zira clearly states that Scar took Kovu in, rather than being his biological father. Yet as Kovu matures, he develops a striking resemblance to Scar, the same lean build, green eyes, and most telling of all, a dark mane. If not through direct inheritance, how can we explain this remarkable similarity? To solve this puzzle, we need to examine the visual evidence for Kovu's true parentage. When we first see Kovu as a cub, he has a brown coat darker than most Pridelands cubs, but lighter than Scar's. His eyes are already green, a trait we've established is recessive in the Pridelands genetic pool. As he matures, his mane comes in. These traits must have come from somewhere in his genetic lineage. Let's consider the possibilities. First, there's the question of Kovu's mother. Zira is presumed to be his biological mother, though this is never explicitly confirmed. If she is, her genetics become crucial to our understanding. Zira's appearance, angular features, a leaner build than most Pridelands lionesses, and a distinctive stripe on her forehead, suggests she may carry some of the same recessive genes that express themselves in Scar. But what about Kovu's biological father? The film never addresses this, creating a significant gap in our understanding. However, using genetic analysis, we can propose several possibilities. The father could be another lion who carried the same recessive traits as Scar, perhaps a relative or Pride member with similar genetic markers. The father might be from outside the Pridelands entirely, introducing new genes that coincidentally produce similar phenotypic results. Most intriguingly, the father could be from Scar's bloodline, perhaps a distant relative who shared some of the same genetic makeup. This third possibility offers a compelling explanation for the resemblance without contradicting the canon statement that Scar isn't Kovu's father. Another fascinating scientific concept that applies here is genetic mimicry. In nature, unrelated organisms sometimes evolve similar traits due to similar environmental pressures, a phenomenon known as convergent evolution. In Kovu's case, being raised specifically to replace Scar, he was subjected to similar environmental conditions that could influence how his... When we track the progression of Kovu's appearance throughout the film, we notice something remarkable. His resemblance to Scar intensifies after he begins his training to usurp Simba. As the psychological conditioning takes hold, his physical traits seem to align more closely with Scar's. This suggests that environmental factors are actively influencing his genetic expression. The most dramatic moment in this genetic narrative occurs when Zira strikes Kovu, leaving him with a facial mark eerily similar to Scar's. While the wound itself isn't genetic, its placement creates a visual parallel that seems to seal Kovu's genetic destiny. It's as if his body is physically manifesting the role he's been groomed to fulfill. This brings us to the scientific concept of epigenetics, changes in gene expression that don't alter the underlying DNA sequence. In recent years, scientists have discovered that traumatic experiences can actually cause epigenetic changes that affect how genes express themselves, and these changes can even be passed down to future generations. In Kovu's case, the psychological trauma of his upbringing, the intense conditioning to become Scar's heir, and the physical trauma of receiving his Scar could all potentially trigger epigenetic changes that enhance the expression of traits already present in his genetic makeup. What's particularly fascinating is the timing of these changes. Kovu's dark mane becomes more prominent as he approaches adulthood and begins his mission to infiltrate Simba's pride. This timing coincides with higher levels of testosterone that occur during lion maturation. And testosterone is known to influence mane development. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for our genetic theory comes from observing what happens when Kovu rejects his conditioning and chooses a different path. While his physical appearance doesn't change, he maintains the dark mane and green eyes. His posture, expressions, and bearing shift subtly. His genetics remain the same, but how those genes express themselves in his behavior. This leads us to our game-changing theory. The dark mane trait appears in lions who are genetically predisposed to rule but are denied their position through conventional means. Both Scar and Kovu fit this pattern perfectly. Scar was born into the royal family but passed over for leadership in favor of Mufasa. Kovu was born with the genetic potential for leadership, but outside the official line of succession. In both cases, the dark mane serves as a visual marker of this alternative leadership genetic. This theory doesn't just explain the physical similarities between Scar and Kovu, it provides a deeper understanding of the genetic forces at work within the Prideland social structure. The dark mane isn't a mark of villainy as much as it is a signal of alternative leadership potential that exists within the Pride. If this theory is correct, it raises profound questions about the future of the Prideland's pride. With Kovu's integration into the royal family and his presumed future role as Kiara's mate, the dark mane genes will be fully incorporated into the royal lineage. What might this mean for future generations of Prideland? With Kovu's integration into Simba's pride and his union with Kiara, the genetic future of the Pridelands enters unprecedented territory. For the first time, the dark mane lineage is not just present but poised to become part of the direct royal succession. This genetic merging raises fascinating questions about what the next generation of Prideland's rulers might look like. To predict the genetic outcomes of Kovu and Kiara's potential offspring, we need to apply some basic principles of genetic inheritance. Kiara carries the dominant golden lineage genes from Simba and Nala, while Kovu brings the recessive dark mane genetic package. In the first generation of offspring, we would expect to see a mixture of traits, with some cubs potentially carrying recessive dark mane genes without it. The introduction of outlander genes into the Prideland's pride represents a significant genetic event known as outbreeding, or genetic rescue. In isolated animal populations, genetic diversity often decreases over time, leading to potential problems from inbreeding. The introduction of new genetic material can invigorate the population, increasing resilience. This genetic infusion challenges us to reconsider our understanding of the dark mane gene. Rather than viewing it as a genetic curse or marker of villainy, we might more accurately understand it as a natural part of the pride's genetic diversity that has been marginalized and misunderstood. In fact, from an evolutionary biology perspective, maintaining genetic diversity is crucial for population survival. A population with varied genetic traits is better equipped to adapt to changing environmental conditions or new challenges. The persistence of the dark mane gene throughout generations, despite its recessive nature, suggests it may offer adaptive advantages in certain contexts. What might these advantages be? Looking at real lion biology provides some clues. Studies have shown that lions with darker manes often display higher testosterone levels, greater wound recovery, and potentially different behavioral adaptations. In a pride structure, having individuals with diverse genetic predispositions could provide evolutionary advantages. Some lions optimized for direct leadership and physical dominance, the golden mane lineage. Others for strategic thinking and adaptive problem-solving, the dark mane. This interpretation aligns perfectly with the themes of the Lion King saga. Throughout the films, we see a progression from division to integration, from exclusion to acceptance. The genetic storyline mirrors this thematic journey. What was once seen as aberrant or threatening, Scar's lineage, is ultimately recognized as a valuable part of. When we consider environmental changes in the Pridelands, this genetic diversity becomes even more significant. The films show the Pridelands experiencing various environmental challenges: drought, fire, and territorial conflicts. A genetically diverse pride with lions adapted for different leadership styles and problem-solving approaches would be better equipped to face these varied challenges. What's particularly intriguing is how these genetic patterns connect to the central philosophical concept of the circle of life. The circle of life isn't just about the food chain or the succession of generations. It's about the balance and interconnectedness of all things. On a genetic level, this means maintaining a balance of diverse traits within the population, ensuring the pride has the genetic tools to face whatever challenges arise. This brings us to our final comprehensive theory. The dark mane gene exists as a natural check and balance within the Prideland's genetic heritage. Not a curse, but a complementary alternative that ensures genetic diversity and resilience in the royal lineage. In this light, Scar's tragedy wasn't that he carried these genes, but that they were treated as inferior or threatening rather than valuable in their own right. Kovu's journey represents the rehabilitation of this genetic lineage, the recognition that these traits have their place in the circle of life. When we apply this understanding to future generations, we can predict that Kovu and Kiara's cubs might express a mixture of traits from both lineages. Some might have golden manes with green eyes, others might have darker manes with amber eyes, and some might carry recessive traits without expressing. More importantly, this genetic integration suggests a future Pridelands leadership that could draw on the strengths of both lineages. The charisma, physical prowess, and direct leadership style of Mufasa's line combined with the strategic thinking, adaptability, and independent perspective that characterizes the dark mane lineage. This genetic merger doesn't erase the distinctive traits of either lineage, but creates the potential for a more adaptable, resilient royal line that embodies the full genetic diversity of the pride. Rather than seeing one genetic path as correct and the other as flawed, the future suggests a recognition that both contribute valuable elements to pride leadership. Will Kovu and Kiara's cubs inherit the dark mane trait? If our theory is correct, some may carry the gene while others may not. More importantly, how these genes express themselves will depend not just on genetics, but on environmental factors, experiences, and how future generations structure the pride's social. The true significance of the dark mane gene may not be in its visible expression, but in what it represents. The acknowledgement that genetic diversity, even traits once misunderstood or feared, strengthens rather than weakens the pride as a whole. The circle of life, it seems, operates not just at the level of ecosystems and generations, but within the very DNA of the Pridelands lions. The integration of these once separate genetic lineages doesn't just heal the social division of the pride, it completes a genetic circle that ensures the pride's continued resilience and adaptability for generations to come. The dark mane was never truly a curse. It was always an essential part of the genetic balance necessary for the pride's long-term survival. Through Kovu, this genetic legacy finds not redemption, but recognition of its rightful place in the greater genetic tapestry of the Prideland. When we began this genetic journey through the Pridelands, we approached the dark mane as a mysterious anomaly, a visual shorthand for villainy. But our scientific exploration has revealed something far more profound, a complex genetic story that parallels the thematic heart of the Lion King itself. The dark mane isn't a simple mutation or random variation. It's a persistent genetic alternative that has existed throughout the pride's history, occasionally expressing itself when specific conditions are met. This recessive trait package carries with it not just physical characteristics, but predispositions toward particular leadership styles, problem-solving approaches, and ways of interacting. What makes this genetic narrative so compelling is how perfectly it aligns with the broader themes of the Lion King saga. At its core, these films explore the tension between tradition and change, between established order and necessary adaptation. The genetic story does the same, showing us how genetic diversity, even when initially perceived as threatening to the established order, ultimately strengthens. The redemption of the dark mane lineage through Kovu isn't just a social or political reconciliation, it's a genetic one. It represents the pride's acknowledgement that genetic diversity isn't something to be feared or suppressed, but embraced as essential to survival. Just as Simba had to learn that Kovu shouldn't be judged by his resemblance to Scar, the pride as a whole learns that the genetic package represented by the dark mane has value and purpose. This genetic narrative even sheds new light on Scar's tragic story. Perhaps his villainy wasn't predetermined by his genetics, but emerged from the pride's failure to recognize and value his different leadership style and abilities. In misunderstanding and marginalizing these traits, the pride inadvertently created the conditions for conflict rather than. Looking at the Lion King through this genetic lens transforms our understanding of its central message. The circle of life isn't just about each species playing its role in the ecosystem, it's about embracing diversity within species as well. It suggests that true harmony comes not from genetic uniformity, but from recognizing how different genetic predispositions contribute to the whole. The visual language of the film supports this interpretation. Notice how the Pridelands flourish most vibrantly when there's balance and integration, while periods of genetic isolation, like Scar's reign or the separation of the Outlanders, coincide with environmental decline. The health of the land itself seems tied to genetic diversity and, perhaps most remarkably, this genetic narrative was hiding in plain sight all along. The careful attention Disney animators paid to consistent physical traits across generations wasn't just artistic thoroughness. It was a sophisticated genetic story told through visual means, waiting for us to decode it. As we consider what this means for future generations of Pridelands lions, we're left with an open question rather than a definitive prediction. Will the integration of the dark mane genes into the royal lineage create new leadership possibilities that draw on the strengths of both genetic pathways? Will Kovu and Kiara's cubs express new combinations of traits that represent not the dominance of one genetic lineage over another, but the harmonious integration of both? The answer, fittingly, remains part of the ongoing circle of life, the continuous adaptation and evolution that ensures the pride's survival across generations. The dark mane was never truly a curse but a misunderstood blessing, a repository of genetic alternatives kept alive through recessive inheritance, waiting for the moment when the pride would recognize its. In that sense, the story of the dark mane gene is the story of the Lion King itself, a journey from fear of difference to celebration of diversity, from division to unity, from mistaking variation for threat to recognizing it as strength. The genetic code hidden in Scar's mane turns out to be not a mark of villainy, but a testament to the importance of genetic diversity in the grand circle of life. This revelation transforms how we view not just Scar and Kovu, but the entire Pridelands saga, a story that, like the double helix of DNA itself, has been spiraling toward a genetic reconciliation that completes the circle and ensures the Pride's resilience for generations to come. When Kovu and Kiara stand together at the end of The Lion King 2, they represent more than just social reconciliation. They embody the completion of a genetic circle that had been broken for generations. Their union isn't just the end of a conflict, but the beginning of a new genetic future for the Pridelands. One where the dark mane and the golden mane no longer represent opposing forces, but complementary strengths in the endless dance of genetics that is, truly,